titled this video how sex tourism can save the world, rather euphemistically, to try and make an important point that there is an incredible amount of ignorance around this subject, and I don't think anybody else is talking about this. And it's important to cut through bullshit and actually tell people what is really going on. Now, I'm a revolutionary of sorts. I have studied politics, history, economics, philosophy, spirituality, religion. And what I have learned is that revolutions first and foremost start inside your head and your heart. And after you get a sense of what is really going on, then you can help reshape the world into a better place. Now, the point of this is basically to come to terms with changing your understanding of the topic of sex tourism and sex work. Now, there is constantly this connection between prostitution and drug abuse and pimping and sex trafficking. And let me tell you that a lot of this is misdirection by the mainstream media. Most of the people on this planet who are sex workers do so in countries where wages are extremely low and where it is their best opportunity to have a better standard of living and a better way of life. And this is something that the mainstream media is not telling you. And let me tell you why the mainstream media is not telling you this. They don't want to tell you that because wages are so low to help giant corporations like Apple make enormous profits, people are turning to selling their bodies because it is a better option than working for Apple in a plant in China. Okay? People, the mainstream media does not want to tell you that because you have to understand the mainstream media is a corporate entity. And the point of the media is actually to represent the best interests of giant corporations exploiting the people on this planet. So they are never going to connect those dots for you, okay? Because they are about disinforming you instead of really informing you about what's going on. So if you come to terms with the idea that sex work is a viable job and that it is the best option in many places for mostly women to do, then this completely changes your whole point of view of sex workers. Sex workers are like taxi drivers or waitresses. It's a job like any other job. Now, do we demonize men who go to restaurants and order food from waitresses? Do we demonize men or people who go and use taxi drivers? No, we actually are happy that they are creating economic activity, stimulating the economy, creating jobs, right? But when it comes to sex work, oh gosh, people are exploiting people. And so on the topic of exploitation, men coming here to Colombia or the Dominican Republic and paying women who are working willingly as sex workers, $40 or $50 an hour, is seen as some form of exploitation. But giant corporations like Apple or Nike going around the world and paying people $1 or $2 to create sneakers or telephones is not viewed as a form of exploitation. Now, you see, this is just an example of the type of misdirection that the corporate mainstream media constantly peddles in trying to keep your thinking in terms of what they want and what is in the best interests of the corporate elite. But when you come to terms with the fact and you actually hear women say, I like being a sex worker, and women are happy to do that, then this completely changes your whole viewpoint of the world. And isn't it interesting that almost nobody is telling you that in countries like the United States and Europe, where people live in sort of this fantasy world where, they want to protect women and children, but don't want to come to terms with the real reason why women and children are trying to sell themselves around the world. And the truth is, these ideas that we have and the ideas that mainstream media promote are a form of denial. because what it does is it removes any culpability of the public who, as consumers, participate in a system of exploitation that promotes poverty and desperation on this planet and puts people in a position where, you know what, selling your body is the best option you can have. And every time you buy Nike sneakers or an iPhone, you are helping to promote that system of exploitation. Now, here in Colombia, prostitution is legal and regulated. And yet there are a great deal of contradictions in Colombian society about this. Colombia wants to sort of be open, but they're also very conservative. And so you see they kind of like, well, we allow prostitution, but we don't want to encourage. We allow sex work, but we don't want to encourage sex work. Okay? And we certainly don't want to encourage sex tourism. Okay? Now, let me give you an example. In the United States, they try to keep people from using and abusing alcohol. And we had a period where we made alcohol use illegal. The sale and use of alcohol was illegal in a period called Prohibition. And what did we find that happened from that experiment? Basically, we found that people found new ways to drink alcohol and new ways to make alcohol. So Prohibition did not work. Okay, the prohibition of prostitution in the United States does not work. There is still plenty of prostitution. On the planet Earth, we prohibit murder, and yet there is still plenty of murder. We will even murder you for murdering people, and yet still there is plenty of murder. Now, basically, the point of this is we have very little control over human behavior. Okay, what we can try to do is discourage certain things and encourage other things. For example, we make cigarette smoking in the United States very expensive now. And the point of that is perhaps making cigarette smoking expensive is going to discourage people from smoking. But the fact is people still want to smoke. The fact is people want to do drugs. The fact is people are still going to have sex. And people still are going to murder each other. That's the reality of life. We have very little control over human behavior. And yet we're going to control human sexuality? Really? Okay. No, what we can do is try to protect the innocent, which of course is, what we should be doing. But let's come to terms with the reality that the standards of living and the sensibilities of life in places like the United States and Europe are very different than the sensibilities of life in a place like Colombia. Okay, where 80% of the population lives on extremely low wages. And so we can't impose the values of society in the United States on the Dominican Republic, okay? Because we could not walk, most of us in the United States could not walk in the shoes of the poorest of the poor in places like Colombia or the Dominican Republic and have a clue what that is about. Even the poorest in the United States don't know anything about that. Okay, so let's not pretend that we know something we don't. And we can't put some template over the whole planet and try to impose that on people. Now, as a person who has spent a lot of time here in Cartagena, I've gotten to know a lot of people, and some of them are sex workers. And let me tell you, in 4 years here, with having friends in the sex worker community of Cartagena, I know many women who now are living in the United States, and many women who have traveled to European countries. And so what I have seen is that the job of being a sex worker here in Colombia has opened a lot of doors and transformed a lot of lives for people here in Cartagena. And so the fact is, being a sex worker is a job like any other job that people do to better their lives. And so why should we have any negative connotations about sex tourism when it is a form of job creation and economic activity? I would say overwhelmingly that it is more something that has the opportunity of bettering people's lives than It does. But that is not something that the mainstream media is going to tell you. It's not something that feminist society is going to tell you. Now, I don't hear Swedish feminists who, are so anti-prostitution going on about how much they care about women and children by, raising living standards on this planet and creating a fairer distribution of wealth on planet Earth. That would be the number one way to protect women and children on the planet. Women and children, then how about you start talking about the main reason anybody becomes a sex worker on planet Earth? Come to grips with reality, people. And so what we have learned is that prohibition doesn't work, and that if people really want to do things, they're going to do them. And so what does work? What does work is us trying to regulate people's behavior and to try and keep people safe. And so, just like we regulate the use of alcohol and alcohol abuse, we can regulate sex work and try to protect sex workers as much as possible. And try to make sure that the only people who are sex workers are people who want to be sex workers. So let me make the most important point I can really make, is the point of me making this video is not to try and promote people becoming sex workers. What it is trying to take control of of behavior that is going on right now. How can societies create safe places for these activities to happen? How can we remove the stigma from, being a sex worker and a sex tourist? How can we tax those activities, make them safe happening here in Latin America and around the world, create a tax base around that, take those funds and use them to try and protect adolescents and children so that in the future, they do not have to become sex workers just like their mothers and, their families are doing right now. What they need most here in Latin America are good paying jobs. And when it comes down to it, being a sex worker is a very good paying job. For example, here in Colombia, in Dominican Republic, Latin America in general, there are no jobs for adolescents. Okay? No jobs. You understand that? The number one reason why anybody under 18 might turn to being a sex worker is there are no other jobs for them to do. Okay? And so, what should Colombia do? Colombia should create safe red light districts. It should tax those activities, and it should create a program to help adolescents find jobs, continue to go to school, job training, or whatever, so that people have other options than to become sex workers. But instead, there's sort of this, prostitution is legal and we don't want to encourage it, but prostitution is going on here all the time. Now, people just don't realize that there are different economic realities in different countries. And a lot of times people's behavior in those countries is because of the different economic reality. The difference between the realities of life in the United States and the realities of life in a place like Colombia make it so that being a sex worker in Colombia or in countries like Colombia with similar economic realities, for example, 80% of the population here lives on extremely low wages. And when they get older, most of them don't have any kind of social benefit for their retirement or, a pension or a social security program. They have their children. The economic reality in many countries around the world is that you expect your children to take care of you and your grandparents when you get older. Okay, that's the economic reality in many places around the world. There's a lot less incentive to go to college here in a place where wages are very low. Are you going to spend the time and the money to go to college to get a job that's not going to pay you very well? And then, the opportunities, the benefits of going to college in places like Colombia,
Yes, you could get a better job, but for a lot of people, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to go and spend your time in college in places like the Dominican Republic and Colombia. You know, so there's a lot of different economic realities, and if people's behavior is based on economic reality, and people want to go, oh well, we should change that behavior. Well, no, you should change the economic reality. That's the reality. Okay. That if the cause of something or a contributing cause to something is economics, then you need to change the economics. Now, I'm not saying all people who turn to being sex workers do so because of, low wages and poverty, etc., but it's a huge factor, and people need to come to terms with that, okay? And the fact that people are trying to survive and live good lives, just like we are in the United States, you can't blame them for doing one of the few things they can do to make a decent living and to make more money and take better care of your family. And let me ask you, how many college-age kids in the United States or Canada or Europe are responsible for making sure their parents and grandparents have food and their rent is paid and that they are not out on the street? Very, very few. But that's, the reality here in places like Colombia. You know what? You're responsible for, taking care of your family. And if that means you have to do what you have to do to make that work, So, I met a woman in the Dominican Republic who was, like 19, and she told me, she said, my mother basically said I needed to get my ass out and work. And let me tell you, wink, wink, they don't really care how you're out there working. They just want you to, basically help support yourself, because in places like the Dominican Republic and Colombia, very few families are in a position to help financially support their almost adult, or adult children. That's the reality of life. The thing we need on this planet is a better distribution of wealth and resources. The fact is, the system that's in place is one that's run by wealthy people and controlled by wealthy people, and it serves wealthy people very well. But you know what? It doesn't serve the other 3/4 of the population very well at all. And that's the reality. And so, to redistribute wealth, what's the best way to do that? To tax people and, give people money? Or to actually, the basis of all economics before we created monetary systems was essentially the barter system. People traded things, that's the reality. Generally people just don't want to give money away for doing nothing, So the reality is that there's a huge redistribution of wealth going on here. And in most cases, nobody is being abused. And so how can we take this redistribution of wealth that is happening willingly by both parties, consenting adults, and turn that into something that can benefit society? And so, I just wanted to talk about, in a place like Colombia here, the many benefits of being a sex worker for a woman. Sex workers basically work for themselves. They create their own hours. They go to work when they want to. They, stay home when they want to. They can work as much as or little as they want based on, their needs. If they have children, they work a lot less being sex workers than they would doing pretty much any other job in, here in Colombia. Let me tell you, they're strong, independent women who basically, move the world in a direction they want it to go to get them into the United States. There is a lot of economic benefits and social benefits that can happen to you being a sex worker,